She wasn't supposed to be out here alone. For 3 straight days, her 12 goats had walked to the exact same spot on the hillside and refused to take another step. They weren't grazing. They weren't frightened. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder, staring into a wall of kudzu as though something beyond the vines was telling them to stay back. Determined to find out why, she gripped her machete and hacked through another curtain of tangled vines. One more swing. Then she froze. What she found hidden beyond that wall of green would explain why 50 forgotten acres, sold for just $1, hid something nobody expected. As you watch, see if you can figure out what the goats noticed before she did, because the answer changed everything that followed. 3 months earlier, those 50 acres had become the piece of land nobody wanted. For nearly a decade, kudzu had swallowed everything in its path, hiding rocky hills beneath thick green vines, erasing old fence lines, and concealing sinkholes that made every step across the property uncertain. The county had grown tired of maintaining it, tired of chasing unpaid taxes and tired of listening to neighboring landowners complain as the invasive vines crept farther each year. When the property finally went to auction, the opening bid wasn't meant to attract buyers. It was simply the county's way of making the problem disappear. At just $1, the land wasn't being offered as an opportunity but abandoned as a burden after 2 previous owners had already tried, and failed, to reclaim it. Both arrived with bulldozers, excavators, and every advantage money could buy, yet both eventually walked away with damaged machinery, broken equipment, and 50 acres that looked almost untouched. Before long, people around town stopped calling it farmland and simply referred to it as impossible. Yet one question refused to leave her mind. If the land had truly been worthless, why had people once invested so much in owning it before letting it disappear beneath years of neglect? The old property records mentioned pasture land decades earlier, but nothing explained how it had vanished beneath the kudzu, and the mystery only made her more determined to uncover the truth. Rather than trying to overpower the land, she decided to outthink it by using 12 goats instead of heavy machinery. The plan was simple, but it came with one serious problem. She had just 1 week before the borrowed goat trailer had to be returned, and without those animals, her entire plan would end before it had even begun. She had no way of knowing that the answer she was searching for was hidden in the only place her goats would refuse to enter. She arrived with 12 goats, a trailer full of portable fencing, water tanks, and a plan that almost everyone believed was doomed from the beginning. There were no bulldozers, no excavators, and no crew waiting to help her. If this land was ever going to be reclaimed, it would happen one section at a time, with 12 hungry goats doing the work that heavy machinery never could. The first week unfolded exactly the way the skeptics expected. Drivers slowed their trucks just to watch the goats disappear into walls of kudzu while she hauled water across steep hillsides, carried fencing from one grazing section to the next, and spent hours cutting narrow paths simply to reach the animals. Some neighbors laughed openly, convinced they were watching someone waste time and money on land that had already defeated people with far greater resources. Others quietly wished her luck, although even they doubted she would last much longer than the owners before her. Then, sometime during the 3rd week, the property began to reveal the first signs of change. Small patches of bare earth appeared where sunlight hadn't touched the ground in years. Weathered fence posts slowly emerged from beneath the vines, followed by sections of old stone walls that nobody realized were still standing. Every evening, the cleared ground stretched a little farther than it had the day before. The progress wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines, but it was steady, and for the first time in years, the land was beginning to give way instead of fighting back. One afternoon, the owner of the borrowed trailer arrived to collect it. He climbed out of his truck expecting to hitch it up and leave, but instead he stood quietly watching the goats work while his eyes drifted across the newly cleared hillside. After several minutes, he turned toward her and smiled. "I've never seen anyone make this much progress out here," he said. "Keep the trailer another month." It was a simple gesture, but those extra weeks meant everything. Without them, her plan would have ended before it ever had a chance to succeed. By the 6th week, however, exhaustion had begun replacing optimism. The fences still had to be moved every few days. Water still had to be hauled across rough ground, and every approaching storm threatened to erase weeks of hard-earned progress. More than once, She sat alone in her truck after sunset, wondering whether the two owners before her had simply recognized failure sooner than she had. Then something happened that neither she nor anyone else could explain. One section of the property remained completely untouched. No matter how much fresh kudzu grew beyond it, the goats walked to the exact same place every morning before stopping together at an invisible line. She ignored it the first day and dismissed it as coincidence the second, but by the third morning, she realized she wasn't watching random behavior anymore. She was watching a pattern, and whatever had convinced 12 goats to stop at the exact same place 3 days in a row was waiting just beyond the wall of vines. At first, she assumed there was a simple explanation. A snake could have built a den beneath the vines, a hidden sinkhole might have opened somewhere ahead, or perhaps the scent of a dead animal was drifting through the undergrowth. Each possibility sounded reasonable enough, so instead of forcing the goats forward, she decided to investigate the area herself. She walked the edge of the clearing, studying the ground for fresh tracks, disturbed soil, or anything that might explain the animal's behavior, but found nothing unusual. The following morning the goats returned to the exact same place, stopped at the same invisible line, and refused to move another step. She searched again with the same result. By the third morning, she could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. Goats are naturally curious animals, yet they also know when pushing forward isn't worth the effort. In front of them stood a dense wall of tangled kudzu, old vines, fallen limbs, and thick undergrowth that had woven itself into a barrier unlike anything else on the property. They could have forced their way through if they had wanted to. Instead, every one of them chose to stop. That was the moment she decided the goats were trying to tell her something she couldn't yet see. She walked back to her truck, reached inside, and wrapped her hand around the handle of her machete. As she climbed the hillside, she began cutting through the thickest wall of kudzu on the property. The first 2 swings sliced cleanly through fresh vines, but the third struck something solid beneath the tangled growth. It wasn't the sharp scrape of stone. It wasn't another curtain of vines. She carefully pulled the hanging vines aside and stared at what the blade had just uncovered. For several long seconds, she simply stood there staring at the spot where the machete had stopped. The blade hadn't struck solid rock as she expected, nor had it hit another fallen branch buried beneath the vines. It had struck wood, but not the kind of wood that should have been standing in the middle of an abandoned hillside. Curious now, she reached forward and pulled away another armful of tangled kudzu. Thick vines slid to the ground, revealing the weathered trunk of an enormous tree that had been hidden beneath decades of unchecked growth. Its bark was rough with age, yet the trunk itself was still solid and unmistakably alive. She took another swing with the machete, clearing a wider opening through the wall of green, and almost immediately another trunk came into view. At first, she thought nothing of it. Mature trees weren't unusual on neglected land, but as she continued cutting her way forward, something about them began to feel strangely deliberate. Every few feet another trunk emerged from beneath the vines, then another beyond it, until she paused and looked more carefully across the hillside. That was when she noticed the pattern. The trees weren't scattered randomly as they would have been if nature had reclaimed the land on its own. They stood in straight, evenly spaced rows that stretched far beyond the small opening she had cleared, each one positioned with the same careful spacing as the last. Someone hadn't simply allowed these trees to grow here. Someone had planted them. As more sunlight filtered through the newly opened canopy, another detail caught her attention. Hanging quietly beneath the leaves were small pieces of fruit, rough-skinned and uneven in shape, their colors shifting from deep crimson to patches of pale yellow. They looked nothing like the polished apples stacked in supermarket displays, yet they weren't spoiled or diseased. They looked like fruit from another era, quietly surviving while the rest of the world had forgotten they were there. She slowly turned, taking in row after row of hidden trees stretching across the hillside, and at that moment the truth finally became impossible to ignore. She wasn't standing inside forgotten woodland. She was standing inside a forgotten orchard. The discovery of the orchard answered the question that had brought her to that hillside, but it immediately raised several others. Someone had clearly planted these trees with care, so who were they? Why had an entire orchard disappeared from memory? And if it had been here all along, how had nobody stumbled across it before now? Knowing she needed answers beyond her own experience, She contacted an elderly orchard specialist who had spent decades identifying old fruit trees on abandoned farms. People sometimes referred to men like him as apple hunters because they traveled from place to place searching for heirloom varieties that had quietly disappeared from commercial agriculture generations earlier. When he arrived a few days later, he walked slowly between the rows without saying very much. Every so often he stopped to study the bark, examine the leaves, or measure the distance between the trees before making a brief note in a small notebook. The longer he explored the orchard, the quieter he became, and his silence made her wonder whether he was seeing something she couldn't. Eventually, he reached up and picked a single apple. Without saying a word, he unfolded a worn pocket knife and sliced it neatly in half. Instead of the bright white flesh found in most modern apples, faint pink streaks spread from the center towards the skin, dense and richly colored in a way she had never seen before. He picked another apple from a different tree, then another from the next row, cutting each one open with the same careful attention. Several minutes passed before he finally lowered the knife, removed his glasses, and slowly looked across the hillside. "I don't think some of these exist anymore," he said quietly. Seeing the confusion on her face, he explained that America had once been home to more than 17,000 named apple varieties. Many developed over generations to suit different soils, climates, and local communities. As commercial farming became more uniform, thousands gradually disappeared. Most weren't deliberately destroyed. They were simply abandoned and eventually forgotten. The kudzu, he explained, hadn't killed the orchard at all. By swallowing the hillside, it had hidden the trees from view and protected them from logging, development, and decades of human interference. Then, almost as suddenly as the mystery of the orchard was solved, another mystery solved itself. The county hadn't knowingly sold a priceless orchard for $1. They had sold 50 acres they genuinely believed contained nothing except invasive vines, because the orchard had vanished from public memory long before it disappeared beneath the kudzu. No surviving records mentioned it. No maps marked its location. And as far as anyone knew, it had simply ceased to exist until 12 goats stopped walking at the same invisible line. Over the weeks that followed, more of the hillside slowly emerged from beneath the blanket of kudzu. Every new section she cleared uncovered another row of fruit trees, another carefully planned piece of an orchard that had survived in silence while the world around it moved on. What had first looked like 50 acres of hopelessly overgrown land was gradually revealing itself as the life's work of people whose names had long since been forgotten. Standing among those trees one evening, she found herself thinking about the family who had planted them. Decades earlier, someone had dug every hole by hand, chosen each variety for a reason, and imagined these trees feeding not only their own family, but future generations as well. Then, somewhere along the way, life changed. Families moved away, farms were abandoned, and the relentless spread of kudzu slowly erased every visible sign that the orchard had ever existed. Eventually, it disappeared so completely that even the county believed there was nothing left to remember. Yet beneath that thick blanket of vines, the trees never stopped doing what they had been planted to do. Season after season, they continued growing, flowering, and producing fruit, patiently waiting for someone willing to look beyond what covered them instead of judging the land by what appeared on the surface. She realized the difference wasn't simply the goats. The men before her had tried to conquer the property with bigger machines, believing the land itself was the problem. She had approached it with patience, allowing the animals to guide her attention instead of forcing the landscape to obey her plan. In the end, the goats hadn't uncovered buried treasure. They had uncovered a forgotten story, proving that history isn't always lost because it disappears. Sometimes it survives in plain sight, hidden beneath years of neglect, waiting for someone patient enough to notice what everyone else has learned to walk past. Looking back, she realized the most important moment hadn't been the day she uncovered the forgotten orchard. It had happened 3 mornings earlier, when 12 goats reached the same tangled barrier, stopped together, and refused to take another step. If they had simply pushed through the vines like everyone expected, she might never have noticed that anything unusual lay beyond them. Instead, they quietly drew her attention to the one place everyone else had overlooked. For years, people believed those 50 acres were worth only $1, not because the land lacked value, but because nobody remembered what had been hidden beneath the kudzu. Sometimes the greatest discoveries don't begin with finding something extraordinary. They begin with refusing to ignore a question that everyone else has already dismissed. So here's something to think about. If you had bought 50 overgrown acres for $1 and your animals refused to enter one small corner of the property, would you have kept searching to uncover what the land was hiding, or would you have walked away like everyone before you? I'd genuinely love to hear what you would have done. And if you enjoy stories where forgotten places reveal extraordinary pieces of rural American history, be sure to subscribe and join us for our next journey.